The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, members participating in the hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the proceedings. As with in-person hearings, members and witnesses are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Those joining remotely should keep themselves muted unless recognized by the chair and should expeditiously unmute themselves when recognized. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately. Good morning. Good morning to everybody, to all of our witnesses, and thank you for joining us in this hybrid hearing. The hearing is entitled, quote, "Bringing Prosperity to Left Behind Communities Using Targeted Place-Based Development to Expand Opportunity." We're grateful you're here. This is our first full day back after a week, so you're going to see members coming in and out, and they'll be here for questions, but don't be disturbed by the fact that people are catching up with all sorts of other things. But we're going to have a good, robust discussion today. And with that, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I am enormously excited to take up this topic for one that is important to all of us, and that's how we address the challenges in those geographical locations that have been or are being left behind. Many of the programs that the federal government and state municipal governments employ are individual-based. Some of them work terrifically well, some of them less so. But we also, of course, take up the challenge that if you ever look at a map of economic prosperity in the country or of social mobility in the country, you know that our challenges are not evenly distributed in the United States, that there are localities that are behind others. And so for a very long time, we have taken up and employed place-based policies. Our country has a long history of employing different place-based initiatives dating back to the 1800s, from state and local business tax incentives to spur economic activity to federal grant support for physical infrastructure and technical assistance for targeted localities. I will note that we'll be actually in Texas with Mr. Gonzalez soon to look specifically at infrastructure and the role infrastructure can play in localities that might otherwise be left behind. These, of course, are policies that help residents in rural areas and urban areas, in historically marginalized communities, and in underserved regions in need of public investment. As you know by now, when I was first tapped by Speaker Pelosi to chair this committee, I committed to examining the issues of economic disparity and fairness and growth with an analytically and fact-driven mentality and a genuine desire to seek, even if they not be broad, areas in which the two parties can agree. Like it or not, given the current configuration of the Congress of the United States, progress will involve buy-in from both parties. And I think we can all agree that the initiatives that we're talking about today can bring job opportunities and services to economically distressed areas and connect more people and communities to the economic prosperity that gives them a shot at the American dream. Today, though, as I'm always interested in, I want to look in particular at specific place-based initiatives to ask the question of what's working and what's not working, and how can we emphasize those things and expand those things that are working and maybe rethink those that are not. What can the federal government do to make these programs and policies more effective for those who need them most, and how can we do that as efficiently as possible, being ever mindful of the resources of the American taxpayer. I'm no stranger personally to place-based politics. Before I got into this crazy business, I spent 5 years at Enterprise Community Partners, working not just on affordable housing, but on how you create the access to jobs, how you create the access to education and training, how you make sure that healthcare is available in a holistic way so that communities, not just people, can thrive and do well. So I look forward to learning about the unique challenges and solutions that will help uplift our left-behind communities and ensure that they have a place in the 21st century economy. With that, I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Stile of Wisconsin, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to today's hearing. We've had the opportunity to go on the road. We were recently in my home state of Wisconsin, in Kenosha and Milwaukee. We've been to Lorain, Ohio. We'll be going to Texas. And I think it's an opportunity to look at how diverse the United States is. I think one of the topics that we're going to discuss today is what is the role of the federal government in particular versus the role of community leaders, state, in local policy. I think it's a really important topic to discuss because life across the United States looks very different. Janesville, Wisconsin, where I'm home, looks very different than downtown New York City and looks very different than rural Idaho. And as we look at this, though, I think what we see often is that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach from the federal government. There's an opportunity to look at making sure that we're addressing the local needs. And then again, is the role the federal government's, or is the role our local governments who are better able to understand the unique challenges that we have in different communities across the United States. That said, I think there's there's a handful of topics that are actually quite consistent across communities and what makes a place a great place to live. One of those is economic prosperity, that there's good paying, family sustaining jobs available in each of our given and respective communities. In particular, not lost on us that there are many communities that face some really challenging times finding good paying, family sustaining jobs. That's true in southeast Wisconsin in some of our communities. It's true across the country. And again, though, I think the question that we're going to be debating today a little bit is what is the role of the federal government in that versus what is the role of local stakeholders, local government, and our state government to make sure that we're doing this efficiently. I think another thing that is really important to discuss in particular that makes a community great is safety. We need to make sure that everyone is able to feel safe in their community, absolutely everyone. Everyone has that right, and I think that's a really important part and topic for us to discuss at a period of time where we're seeing crime rates dramatically increasing across the United States. What makes a community a great place to live, to work, to raise a family? Being able to feel safe in your home community, I think, is a really important part of that. There's also intangibles, a sense of community pride, and I reflect back, Mr. Chairman, when you were joining us with the full committee in Kenosha, I think you said something along the lines of you can feel something here, that there are people that love our home community. That's true in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or Janesville, where I'm home. It's true in countless communities across the United States. People feel a sense of pride in the communities that they live in, and our best communities are those where individuals do feel that sense of pride, and a civic pride is often developed through community organizations. It's one of the reasons I was so challenged, in particular with the administration's Build Back Better plan and its attacks on faith-based organizations. Many of these faith-based organizations in some of our most important in distressed and challenged communities are some of the most important service providers. And so where we see faith-based organizations under attack, whether or not that we had a robust conversation, in particular as it related to the child care provisions and Build Back Better, the role in the challenges that I think our faith-based providers would have had that proposal become law, would have had a really significant impact in a lot of our most challenged communities. I think we're also going to, as I noted, discuss what's the role of the federal government. Are bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. the answer? Or again, is it community leaders, community stakeholders that are best positioned to address the challenges that we afford? We've seen time and again Washington step in with millions, then with billions, most lately with trillions. Sometimes where we have challenges and problems, throwing money at the problem doesn't solve the problem. Sometimes it actually exacerbates it and can make it worse. And so I think we have an opportunity today to delve into some case studies where the federal government has thrown significant money at some of our big challenges across this country, and what are the real-world ramifications, real-world impacts of the vast investment from the federal government. Did it solve the problem when we look back, or did it actually simply move the problem down the road, not actually solve the underlying problem? So I'm well aware everybody's hometown is different. Everybody hopefully has a pride in their hometown like I do. I think most of us do. And most of us want what's best for all of our communities. I think I look forward to today to a robust conversation of what's the role of the federal government. How do we address these challenges? And I think we're going to see an opportunity to make sure we don't provide a one-size-fits-all approach for Washington. Mr. Chairman, thanks for holding today's hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Before we turn to our witnesses, I ask for unanimous consent to play a very brief 4-minute video in which we hear from people out there talking about their experiences that we as a committee have always tried to center. We want to make this more not just members of Congress talking to subject matter experts, but hearing from the American people. So without objection, we'll just take a 4-minute interlude here to run the video. Please go ahead.
My name is Sharon Vogel. I am a member of the Cheyenne River tribe located in South Dakota. I am the executive director of the Cheyenne River Housing Authority for our tribal government. the sense of community is really an important aspect of Lakota culture. One of the things that's happening throughout Indian country is overcrowding and lack of housing. That commute for our communities can be, 100 miles a day, you know. So in 2016, we started our journey of, really being able to apply for competitive funding for housing development projects. We now have impacted 95 families. The most challenging things about leveraging money, especially when you're going to apply for government programs, is the bureaucracy of accessing the funds intended for the poorest of the poor. Without this funding, we would not, we would only have had our $3 million that we invested into it. If you can show that you have a need, then your community should receive that funding. When you get into housing development and you are able to have a strategic approach, you not only contribute to the stability of families, but you contribute to the economy and therefore create jobs. For me personally, I mean, it's not only rewarding, but it just motivates me to even try harder.
Here in Pennsylvania, we had one of the worst economic shutdowns of any state. So you think New York, you think California, you think Pennsylvania. When federal bureaucrats parachute in and tell us what we need, it gets very frustrating because they have no sense of what Pennsylvania, particularly rural Pennsylvania, really is like. What we need is actually less federal government. We need more focus on allowing states to operate and local governments to operate freely. We don't need more bureaucrats. We don't need more regulations. We don't need more help from government. If you create an environment where everyone is treated equally with low taxes, broad base, you'll get better outcomes every single day. Having a one-size-fits-all solution from DC has never worked, will never work. And returning that power back to states and local governments is the most important thing Congress and the federal government can do moving forward.
Okay, we turn now to our witnesses, and just by way of quick introduction, first we will hear from Dr. Tim Bartik, Senior Economist at the Upjohn Institute's Place-Based Research Initiative and co-director of the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. Next, we'll have Mr. Jay Williams, President and CEO of the Hartford Foundation, located in the state of Connecticut, the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, the former mayor of Youngstown, Ohio, and the former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Economic Development Administration. Next, we have Dr. Tracy Haddon-Lowe, fellow at the Brookings Metro, Auntie and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Cheryl Hills, Executive Director of Region 5 Development Commission at the National Association of Development Organizations. And lastly, we'll have Mr. Levon Johnson, the President and CEO of Elkhart, Indiana's Chamber of Commerce. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer directly in front of you that will indicate how much time you have left. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. I ask that you be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears, to quickly wrap up your testimony so we can respect the time of the other witnesses and the committee members. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Dr. Bartik, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Hines, Ranking Member Stile, and other members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. 105 million Americans live in distressed local labor markets, which are metro areas or rural commuting zones that lack sufficient jobs. 55 million Americans live in disadvantaged neighborhoods where the employment rate is much lower than the rest of their local labor market. These low employment rates are a key driver of many social problems, including substance abuse, crime, family breakups, and poorer child development. My testimony today argues that these problems can be solved by place-based policies that bring job opportunities to the people in distressed places. To do this effectively, though, we must confront some common misconceptions. We cannot solve this problem by moving people out of their communities. Because all of us have valuable ties and pride in the family and friends of our home places, policymakers cannot get enough people to move to make this strategy work at any reasonable cost. Even if this strategy worked, it hurts those left behind. Outmigration reduces local demand enough that jobs are reduced by the same percentage as population. So even with outmigration, the local employment rate in a distressed place will stay low. What does work? For local labor markets, we can best increase job creation by providing businesses with customized services. Such customized services include infrastructure, customized job training, and business advice programs such as manufacturing extension that help businesses target new markets. Based on research, these customized services to businesses have a cost per job created that is less than 1/3 that of business tax incentives. Past successful regional programs have used this public service approach to create private sector jobs. A good example is the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, which from the 1930s on used rural infrastructure and other services to create jobs. To help distressed neighborhoods, the research shows that enterprise zone programs that only provide tax breaks for neighborhood investments are ineffective in helping the residents of the neighborhood. Preliminary findings for the Opportunity Zone program are similarly negative. Part of the problem is that neighborhoods are not labor markets. Most jobs located in any neighborhood are not held by the neighborhood's residents, so simply plopping jobs down in the neighborhood does not necessarily help a neighborhood's residents. What can help a neighborhood's residents get a job? Increasing the community's ability to access good jobs, not just through transit or through providing reliable cars, but making sure residents can access services such as job training and childcare. In designing place-based policies, as already mentioned, federal policymakers should recognize that one size does not fit all. But on the other hand, distressed places don't have the resources to do it on their own. Urban areas have different needs from rural areas, and each area has different industrial bases, amenities, or proximity to markets, which dictate different strategies. Therefore, the best way to assist distressed places is through a flexible federal block grant that allows communities to target their particular needs. I have proposed using one block grant to help distress local labor markets and another to help distress neighborhoods. A meaningful program to help distressed places would cost about $33 billion annually. After 10 years, a program of that size would close about 1/3 of the employment rate gap between distressed places and more booming places. Such a program is similar to the Tennessee Valley Authority in per capita spending levels, but provides help for more regions. We need TVA levels of per capita assistance to help residents of all distressed places in the United States, both distressed neighborhoods, distressed rural areas, distressed urban areas, to gain access to good jobs. Such a program would benefit both distressed places and would also benefit the overall national economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bartik. Mr. Williams, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Himes and Ranking Member Stile, thank you both, along with the members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify today. My testimony is informed by more than 20 years of practical experience in economically distressed communities. As the former mayor of Youngstown, Ohio, I helped craft a vision for a city that had experienced amongst the most prolonged and significant economic upheaval of any American city. My experience also encompasses my tenure as a former director of the U.S. Office of Recovery for Auto Communities and Workers, and later the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development, where I led the U.S. Economic Development Administration. And finally, my current role as President and CEO of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. I have traveled extensively across this country, spending considerable time on the ground in both urban and rural communities, engaging directly with a diverse array of stakeholders, many of whom were reflected in the video we saw to start this hearing, on talking about the issue of economic disparity and fairness and growth. A common thread that connects all of these areas is the recognition that while federal policy can't be individually tailored to each community, federal policy works best when it provides an appropriate amount of flexibility for communities to leverage the assets and the opportunities that are unique to the economic development challenges that they are seeking to overcome. During my tenure as Assistant Secretary of EDA and the Office of Management and Budget crafted a vision for the effective integration of federal development resources and the institutionalization of the administration's successful place-based initiatives, which is the very issue this select committee has convened around. The premise of the idea was that the federal government spends over $20 billion every year in economic development programming for needs identified in both urban and rural communities. But there are several departments and agencies that are responsible for this funding, including Commerce and HUD, SBA, the EPA, Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Transportation, the Appalachian Regional Commission, and the Delta Regional Authority, just to name a few. Federal funding related to economic development from across agencies could be integrated and tied to a common and standardized regional economic development strategy. A version of EDA's comprehensive economic development strategies, otherwise known as CEDS, is a good example of how this might work. With private sector input and modifications to encompass areas not under economic distress, EDA's CEDS model could serve as the anchor for integrating federal economic development investments. Partnering with philanthropy to increase economic opportunity is also something that I think has great promise. The Hartford Foundation for Public Giving is one of the oldest and largest community foundations in the country. The foundation has been actively learning what is the role of philanthropy in general and community foundations more specifically in helping to create more inclusive growth and economic opportunity with a focus on addressing systemic inequities most acutely impacting residents of our region. And our region both encompasses rural and urban areas. In 2020, the Hartford Foundation completed a landscape scan that focused on strategy development to address the racial ethnic wealth gap in our region. We found that strategies must have a racial equity lens and contribute both to immediate and direct emergency relief, such as the COVID and stimulus and rental assistance, while also supporting longer-term wealth-building strategies, i.e. pathways to home ownership, a combination of coaching and technical assistance, and access to capital to encourage stability and growth of small businesses that make up the fabric and the economies of our local communities. Policies developed for specific communities should be informed by those who are most impacted in the development, the design, and the implementation phase of that work. As an example, programs could require and fund the use of resident advisory and participation councils. The foundation, in collaboration with two other Connecticut community foundations, are currently supporting a Baby Bonds Parent Advisory Council to inform the implementation of a baby bonds program for the state of Connecticut for children who are covered under the state's Medicaid program. In our cities, we must adopt revitalization strategies that also provide Black and Latinx residents meaningful ownership opportunities so they can be benefactors of neighborhood growth and vitality. However, in cities like Hartford, where an appraisal gap exists, ownership does not always lead to wealth building. Federal programs and subsidies to support increased home ownership and revitalization of small and mixed-use single-family and multifamily developments is critical. The foundation recently provided a housing advocacy grant to the Hartford Land Bank, which resulted in a $20 million from the Connecticut General Assembly for a new homeownership subsidy in a qualified census tract in collaboration with community development financial institutions. While this is a start, federal funding could help really accelerate that. I close with this. The federal government does indeed have a vital role in facilitating economic transformation of our most underserved urban and rural communities. Jobs aren't created by politicians or government agencies. However, federal policies do create a critical role in shaping the economic environment. And finally, federal policy plays a crucial role investing in infrastructure, promoting innovation, and encouraging regional cooperation, which likewise boosts that private sector investment. In an environment of scarce resources, I appreciate the opportunity for this committee to study how to be strategic, equitable, and sustainable as we look to lift up all communities in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Dr. Lowe, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, members of the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to offer testimony. My name is Tracy Lowe, and I'm a fellow with the Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking at Brookings Metro. I'm here today to share insights from our work at the center to build more great places that work for more people. In the last 20 years, even as the national poverty rate has remained pretty stable, the number of people living in neighborhoods with extremely high poverty rates has more than doubled. In other words, we have a serious and proliferating problem of poor places, and research has found that these places produce worse outcomes for their residents in terms of lifetime earnings, health, odds of incarceration, and more, even for residents who are not poor themselves. So what are we doing about this? Billions of dollars have been spent on federal place-based programs over the decades. However, some of these programs have left chips on the table because they aren't targeted at the right challenges, in the right places, in partnerships with the right local actors. First, the stated purpose of most place-based federal programs has been to drive business growth, job creation, and investment in low-income communities. But few, if any, place-based programs have been structured to meet these objectives by supporting local growth or business ownership, and instead have worked primarily by attracting outside investment. Opportunity zones, for example, don't have any mechanism to commit capital to increasing wages, creating new jobs for residents, or offering entry points for residents to ownership of properties or businesses. There is no obligation to invest in projects that existing residents even want. So, we see cases of opportunity zone funds being leveraged for extremely marginal land uses, such as self-storage facilities or data centers. Similarly, looking at New Markets tax credits, parking construction is an eligible project activity, and its incentives do not target local ownership. In addition, using foregone tax revenue as the primary funding mechanism means that the recipient must provide the cash up front and bear all the risk. This encourages investments to go towards strong projects that might have attracted private investment anyway, and leaves socially beneficial projects still struggling to access capital. Second, place-based policies have often targeted the wrong places, either by being too expansive and diffusing impact, or through loopholes. For example, places eligible for New Markets tax credits contain roughly 40% of the US population, though credits are awarded competitively. CDBG is even more expansive in its coverage. Other programs, for example, empowerment zones, had narrowly centered on very low-income communities that face high and multiple market obstacles to growth, rather than on so-called middle neighborhoods, where federal intervention could be a key stabilizing force. Moreover, eligibility criteria can create loopholes that undercut stated program objectives, as happened in some cases with opportunity zones. That's how we got designated zones that do not have any resident population, and opportunity zone funds facilitating development in remote areas like the Arctic Circle. Finally, many federal programs have either not prioritized local leadership and expertise or haven't invested in building it. Without high-capacity local partners in implementation, program targets may not know about, trust, or be in a position to take advantage of program tools. This is one of the reasons New Markets tax credits have achieved longevity. They are deployed through certified community development entities, generally high-capacity organizations that are required to have a primary mission of serving low-income communities. Opportunity zones are back in the news with the recent introduction of the Opportunity Zones Transparency, Extension, and Improvement Act last month. This program has been tremendously impactful at unlocking billions in capital for investments in emerging markets, but has fallen partially short of the ostensible purpose of helping low-income communities. For example, it's funding new hotels in hot market downtowns, while zones in legacy cities are still waiting for their first deal. The proposed reforms to tighten targeting, pair OZ fund capital with flexible grants for local capacity, and increase reporting requirements are good. I urge this committee to take the accumulated lessons of over a half-century of place-based policy to recommend more targeted, next-generation approaches characterized by greater precision to the what, where, and who. When confronting the challenges of concentrated poverty, place-based policies make sense and can actually work. The federal government can revitalize struggling neighborhoods and advance economic justice. But to get even better outcomes, we'll need to design these policies even better. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. Ms. Hills, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stile, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today. I am proudly the Executive Director of Region 5 Development Commission, which delivers community and economic development initiatives in 5 rural counties in central Minnesota. I'm also a member of the National Association of Development Organizations, NATO, which advocates for regional development organizations like mine across the country. I commend this committee for exploring policies that can help reduce economic disparities. In doing so, I encourage you to prioritize approaches that empower regional stakeholders to highlight specific local needs as priorities for federal investments. For example, my organization is nearly one of 400 economic development districts, called EDDs, across the country. The EDD federal designation is given by the U.S. Department of Commerce, the folks we know of at EDA. The work of the EDDs is supported by the EDA Partnership Planning Grant Program and by a variety of other EDA and other federal agency investments. One of my organization's important roles is to address regional critical issues determined by a resident-driven plan called the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. You heard that acronym before, called the CEDS. The CEDS planning process empowers diverse stakeholders to come together to identify locally important priorities. In turn, EDA awards points to grant applications that align with our region's CEDS, which further incentivizes more regional collaboration. Done well, the CEDS is an intentional, equitable economic pathway designed by diverse voices. Every day, as practitioners, my team brings together businesses, local government leaders, philanthropy, nonprofits, and social advocacy agencies to improve the regional quality of life. We ensure that planning processes are pretty inclusive by hiring multilingual translators, offering transit passes to residents with limited mobility, and obtaining input from those without broadband access in rural areas. And engagement by invitation through our established relationships with populations like our Leech Lake Band of Ojibwa, our Agua Gorda growers, LGBTQ+ populations, and Amish and other diverse residents. I think it's important to note that we measure success of all of these projects and programs based on the livelihoods, improved livelihoods, and ownership for those living on the margins of our economy. As Tracy says, the who matters. I encourage policymakers to promote equitable place-based development by continuing to invest in regional planning processes that are inclusive of these diverse voices, encourage more federal entities to award preference points that projects that align with regionally driven plans, and invest directly in not only EDDs, but the other regional stakeholders, like was mentioned, CDFIs and others, that cultivate capacity strengthening and resilience, as this is the foundation for making these programs more successful. In addition to promising approaches like these, I want to mention a few barriers and policymakers should strive to remove. You know, most federal grant competitions and these programs are inherently fair in the sense that all applicants are held to the same set of guidelines and rules. However, many of these federal competitions are not inherently equitable because economically disadvantaged applicants are often unable to compete with more resourced applicants who can easily retain full-time proposal writers, leverage more sources of match funding, and otherwise better position themselves to compete for federal dollars and these private sector place-based programs. I encourage this committee to take action to reduce these barriers within the federal, not only grant making, but program application processes, especially for rural and underserved communities by, first, let's reduce that local match funding requirements. Federal investments can be as high as a 1-to-1 match, which is unattainable for many communities. Specifically, for EDA planning grants, NATO recommends increasing the federal share to 90%, reducing the local match to 10%. Second, let's provide some pre-development funding to support early-stage project development activities that are necessary, like the environmental narratives and the preliminary engineering and that grant writing assistance. That communities without this capacity, they're not able to fairly compete. Third, increasing direct investments in regional partners who are committed to advancing what we call equitable economic ecosystems. The approximately $70,000 a year, the EDA annual investment of the EDDs is the most flexible use of federal funds available to rural regions. But even with the local match, funding restraints limit the amount of implementation EDDs are able to deliver. By investing more in those organizations that are serving communities with low capacity and high need, we can maximize these federal investments and programs. NATO recommends increasing the authorized funding level from the EDA Partnership Planning Grant from $100 million annually in the EDA reauthorization language. Fourth, let's ensure that regional partners, and this was mentioned, are included on advisory committees that regularly consulted by federal agencies, like EDA. And finally, let's pass a 2023 Farm Bill that prioritizes rural economic development within the RD title and reauthorize EDA, which has not been done by Congress since 2004. That is 18 years ago. Economic, social, and environmental conditions have changed monumentally since then. It's imperative to modernize EDA so that federal investments are more relevant to today's realities. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hills. Mr. Johnson, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Style, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm here to talk to you about the city of Elkhart County, Indiana, and the surrounding region. My testimony today will focus on our region's work to identify, develop, implement, evaluate, and continuously improve the economic station of everyone involved in our labor market. Like every community, Elkhart County has a combination of traits that make us unique. I am often asked what characteristics have allowed Elkhart County to remain an economic bellwether for the country. We believe our collaborative spirit, entrepreneurial ecosystem, economic resilience, philanthropic nature, and cultural diversity are the right mix that provide for opportunities in our communities. We believe that place-based initiative rooted in local inclusion at the direction of impacted stakeholders have led to sustainable practices that give us the ability to be agile in all economic climates. 5 times from 2008 to 2020, Elkhart has served as a convenient backdrop for presidential visits where we have been talked to and received campaign promises. While we appreciate the attention and the theater of political campaigns, we also believe that there is a purposeful and intentional speed of government and a speed of business. In Elkhart County, when addressing challenges, we choose to move at the speed of business. Too often, the wait in any other way is tiresome and frustrating. In 2008, during the recession, when our unemployment rate was over 20%, national projections indicated it would take Elkhart 20 years, if ever, to recover. By 2012, we had mostly righted the ship. This was done through the support of local and regional entities that believed in and understood Elkhart County business, communities, and that our resilience had prepared us for times like this. Had we waited on outside solutions, we would still be 6 years away from our pre-2008 economic strength. In 2018, after 2 consecutive record years in the recreational vehicle production, our unemployment rate was often below 3%. National economic attention once again turned its eyes to Elkhart County as RV production and sales did not match the previous 2 years. As media outlets and national economists were trying to lay the narrative that based on our history, the slight decline was a sign of a possible looming recession. And most recently, at the beginning of our current pandemic, the unemployment rate in Elkhart County jumped to 28.6%. Clearly, there was great concern not only for the physical health of our community, but economically as well. It was in that intersection that once again proved that local action ahead of national response was the right move for Elkhart County. Businesses that were deemed essential immediately collaborated around the right protocols and safety measures to help mitigate the spread of the virus in the workplace. In this time, many of our businesses made the intentional pivot to support our healthcare system by shifting their production to provide the PPE materials that were needed by our healthcare professionals. In the first quarter of this year, Elkhart County's unemployment rate on average was below 1%, and by our most recent monthly data is currently at 1.8%. The focus of this hearing is targeted policies to expand local economic opportunities for underserved community. It is often said that rising tides raise all ships, but as I was recently reminded, that only matters if everyone is on the boat. We also understand that there are common threads of challenges that impact all communities, regardless of state, city, or zip code. Local identification of those challenges and the convening of community-minded individuals and organizations has led to innovative, creative, and engaged solutions. As an example, through collaboration in the South Bend Elkhart region, we have established a goal of being in the top 20% of metro areas for minority income equity by 2030. By collectively researching best practices, developing and implementing solutions that fit our needs and goals, the following action items are in process to continually evaluate progress and quickly adjust to needs to increase economic opportunities for everyone, including in those in the underserved communities. Workforce development strategies that encourage encourage and work with companies to develop clearly defined career pathways, collaboration of business and education to address the skills gap that is often a barrier to employment and higher paying jobs, and public-private partnerships that have led to millions of dollars in investment in facilities, programs, and infrastructure that provide easier access to tools necessary for closing the wage gaps. Entrepreneurial support, consulting, and mentoring programs that help individuals go from ideation to startup to sustainability and growth. Public-private investments and quality of life initiatives that support amenities that encourage neighborhood and community growth and engagement, the redevelopment of underutilized or no longer utilized properties, and programming aimed at neighborhood stability. In addition, a significant focus has been placed in housing, understanding that the greatest transfer of wealth in Elkhart County is often property, and we want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity for home ownership and a host of other issues that we are looking at locally. Again, I want to thank you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation and share Elkhart's story.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I now recognize myself to start the questions. And Dr. Bartik, I'd like to start with you. In your testimony, you were very explicit about the notion that programs that only offer tax incentives to firms or to investors are often suboptimal, sometimes fail to achieve their goals. I wonder, take a minute or two and just reflect on the Empowerment Zone program and give us a sense, expand on the notion of what it looks like when it's only about tax incentives and what else can be combined with tax incentives to lead to more successful outcomes.
Well, the problem with tax incentives is that a lot of times they incentivize things that would have happened anyway. You can't read the minds of developers and know whether or not the program would have, the project would have happened anyway, even without the, I don't know why it's having that feedback, but why the program would have happened anyway. What empowerment zones did that was different and is that in addition to trying to incentivize job creation and hiring in the neighborhood, they also gave a block grant to each neighborhood that was used in practice for job training. It was used for small business job creation. It was used for nurturing the growth of small businesses. And those kind of services directly help residents of the distressed neighborhoods. So the problem with a lot of these neighborhood programs, beyond simply that a lot of what you incentivize would have occurred anyway, is that simply putting jobs and investment in a neighborhood is not enough to help the neighborhood's residents because, you know, neighborhoods are not labor markets. We need to directly help residents of distressed neighborhoods who are really going to make a difference.
Thank you, Dr. Bartik. Dr. Lowe, let me come to you. I was doing a little work in advance of the hearing trying to understand what we know about success in the Opportunity Zones program. You made a point that was important, which is collecting data and putting parameters around these programs is really important. What are your initial thoughts around whether we're doing that enough and what the implications may be in the Opportunity Zones program? And if we had an opportunity to revisit that, what would you recommend we do?
Thanks for that question. I would also like to add about empowerment zones that the specific issue there is that the tax credits were for businesses located in the zones. And so in order to benefit from a tax credit, you must have a tax liability. And many of the businesses located in empowerment zones had very limited tax obligations. Specifically regarding opportunity zones, it's absolutely critical that we have some reporting requirements put on this program. I think that the IRS regs were a huge missed opportunity to do that. And we, as a research community, are struggling to answer basic questions such as how many projects are there that have received capital support from Opportunity Zone funds? And if we can't even find how many projects there are, then it's even harder to evaluate the impact of the program.
Okay. So it sounds like you think we should impose more reporting, more data collection on the current OZ program.
Unequivocally.
Okay.
It is essential.
Okay. Okay, my last question is just my remaining minutes here. One of the interesting tensions that's coming through today, it's in very political language, but it's the tension between the resources that come from the federal government, but we don't want those bureaucrats and we don't want, you know, the tension feels like most communities want these resources, but they want say and participation and engagement so that these programs are in fact responsive to conditions on the ground, which in fact may not be fully appreciated in places like HUD and HHS. So I wonder, let me just throw this open to the panel as a whole. How can we do better in that regard? And what communities in particular or programs in particular can we hold up as examples of getting that balance right, of the scale of the federal government with the input of specific local communities and community groups?
I think one thing that has been mentioned here multiple times is an example of the block grant program. That is a federal government program at significant scale, but it recognizes the important flexibilities and uniquenesses of each community, how they can apply those funds. It does require accountability, which is important when you're dealing with public taxpayer funds, but that flexibility, that ability to also partner with the private sector and leverage those dollars, I think, is an example that both urban and rural areas have used successfully, will continue to use successfully. And I think to the extent that, in addition to everything else that was talked about, highlighting programs like that provide that flexibility, that partnership, because I don't know that there's any way to ultimately lift up urban and rural distressed areas if you don't have partnerships between the federal, state, local government, and the private sector. And the block grant program has many successful examples of that.
And I guess I would add to that, that's essentially how past successful federal state programs worked. When you look at TVA, that was very flexible how the money was used. We look at the Appalachian Regional Commission, that was very flexible how things were used. We look at empowerment zones, the block grant that was provided, which was in today's dollars about $170 million per zone, was quite flexibly used. I would add, though, you'd have to make sure that it's sufficient resources to solve the problem. I mean, the challenge of trying to turn around distressed places, there are great social and economic benefits that makes it well worth it, but it's not cheap to do. It simply isn't cheap to do. So, for example, TVA at its peak during the 1950s cost about $300 per capita during that period per year. $300 per capita per year. For the average local government in the US, that's 14% of their local tax revenue. I mean, a distressed place cannot really find 14% of its, I mean, maybe it's conceivable, but it's very difficult for them to find 14% of the local tax revenue for 10 years to either increase taxes or lower public services spending, which would hurt their economy in other ways. To do that for 10 years is very hard. So I think it's important, in addition to talking about block grants and federal flexibility, the federal government has the resources to really help these communities jumpstart their economy. And so that's the reason why we can't simply say, let's just let these distressed places solve their own problems. It's very difficult for them to do so.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bartik. I recognize the ranking member for his questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate everyone's testimony. Dr. Lowe, I really appreciate your comments on opportunity zones. I think it's correct that we're all looking for more data. And I think one of the reasons it's so intriguing on the opportunity zone side is because it really takes the federal government out of the way and makes it local decisions. And so what I'm hearing time and again from many on the panel is how, in instances, the federal government's not working directly with local stakeholders. And so the question is there an opportunity to pull the federal government out of the way? I think opportunity zones may be there. I think we're all looking for some additional data on that, so I appreciate your comments there. I'd like to move to you, if I can, Mr. Johnson, and get a look back as to where federal funds were used, in particular in Elkhart, your home community, how well they were spent. Was that the driver, or was it a different driver that got Elkhart back on track? I reflect, Elkhart's on Interstate 90. It ultimately goes to Janesville, Boston, all the way out to Seattle. And so I passed Elkhart as I was driving out during the midst of the coronavirus when you couldn't catch a flight and we were coming out and dealing with the CARES Act. And so familiar with your community. And as we look, is it correct that following the 2008-2009 Great Recession, that Elkhart received $39 million in green energy projects for an electric truck or a refit of a manufacturing facility to produce electric trucks?
That would be correct. I would tell you, as of May of 2022, none of the companies that money was invested in to start that work exist any longer.
So if we look at that, right, so $39 million of taxpayer dollars was put into a specific project in Elkhart with the goal of creating 400 jobs and producing electric trucks?
That was the goal.
And today, there's 0 trucks being produced and 0 jobs in existence from that $39 million investment?
Other than the facility has been retrofitted to make RVs. And again, I think part of the tension that the chairman talked about is almost in the premise of the question, and that would be a great example of, I don't remember anybody in the community that existed that said, we want to make green cars in this. It was this is an area that does this is what we're gonna give them, this is what we're gonna give it for, as opposed to the return on that being the flip of that, us coming and saying, this is what we do, here's how we see getting out of this, here's how we're going to create jobs, and let you know if we need anything.
So as we look at how the stimulus dollars were used following the Great Recession, the Obama-Biden administration puts $39 million in. Well, maybe not 100% waste. The vast majority of that doesn't get led on target to get either A, the final product built, or B, a sustainable job that's lasted until today.
It is 14 years later, it does not exist.
So I think what I'm hearing, right, is the challenge of spending millions of dollars to solve a problem from the federal government's perspective doesn't get the job done. We spend billions of dollars, now we're spending trillions of dollars. And the question is there a better approach? And my understanding is Elkhart, as we go into the Great Recession, was it was very highly concentrated in one industry. Is that correct?
That would be correct, although I believe, I will say, we're much more diverse in our economy than often is reflected.
Today or then?
I would say even then, I would say even more so now. We've done a great job of communicating that we're the RV capital, but there's so much more happening.
And I think that's a really important point. I mean, I come from the community of Janesville is heavily dependent on one auto facility. Kenosha had similar experiences. When those large employers depart, it's very challenging. And diversifying the employment base, I think, is really important. That can't always be done from a federal government, but there are local stakeholders that can step up to the plate and work to diversify the employment base in a community so that if one of these large employers shifts, that other employers can step up to the plate. My concern from our perspective as we watch this Keynesian economic approach is that we're going to have the federal government step in, send money down, often doesn't work with the local stakeholders in the community, which we heard time and again from an array of our panelists here today. And when that money then is being spent, it ultimately doesn't get led on target, which would actually get a final product made, but I'm more concerned about sustainable jobs, and a central command doesn't allow it to be sustainable. And so, Mr. Chairman, we got flies flying around in this committee hearing room. I think it's impacting more than one of us. I won't say that I'm the only sweet guy here in the room that's getting them. But I will say that I am concerned about this untargeted spending that we see, the implications. And I'm optimistic that we can use pro-market approaches like the opportunity zones. And I appreciate you, Dr. Lowe, bringing up the need for additional data, because I think all of us, and me in particular, are very optimistic that we're going to see ways that we can tweak, reform this program to really bring the investment into some of our, in particular, our urban cores, whether or not that's mid-sized cities or large cities, where the jobs have shifted away. So I think there's some opportunities here. I think there's more data that's needed, and appreciate you being here with us, Mr. Johnson.
Can I just add real quickly to that point? I think one of the things that I've heard up here and is critical is the fact that at the local level, when movement comes from the local level, there's a different sense of accountability to make sure that things get done.
I could not agree more. Cognizant of the time, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Gonzalez is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here. My question, Dr. Lowe, you critique the what, where, and who of our place-based programs. I'm interested in the who part of that you mentioned. Can you elaborate on how our federal government programs have not prioritized community leadership and expertise and how we can better support our local leaders with our programs? You specifically mentioned set-asides to invest in the capacity of local actors. Is something we are well versed in. Can you elaborate on this, please?
Thank you for that question, sir. Yeah, so I think new markets tax credits might be a helpful example right now. I mentioned how they are deployed through certified community development entities that are required to have a primary mission of serving low-income communities. So I think new markets tax credits have been very impactful because they flow through these high-capacity entities that are rooted in place and that know what their places need. The issue is that these credits are awarded competitively, and they go to the places that have high-capacity CDEs that can compete for the credits and get them. Places that have been successful at opening the new markets tax credit fire hose have been able to transform themselves and do an incredible job. But I especially think of aging inner ring suburbs outside the favored quarter. These are places where a huge chunk of the US population lives now. They are much thinner in terms of civic infrastructure than urban cores, and they don't have CDEs already in place that can get this work started. It is not enough to love your place and to care about it a lot. That is very, very important. That is absolutely the most magic first critical ingredient. But these places need investments in capacity so that they can stand up their own CDEs.
Yeah, very well, thank you. My next question is to Ms. Hills. Thank you for coming to testify today. In your testimony, your fourth suggested solution was to modernize federal programs prioritizing rural and undeserved regions. I happen to represent one of those. Could you elaborate on your suggestion to pass a new farm bill that promotes rural-urban linkages and interdependence?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we've talked a lot about the importance of having these local industry clusters, we call them value chains, be asset-driven and come from those local communities. And I think in some cases, our programs like RD, USDA, Rural Development, and EDA, and other federal agencies that are able to the chairman's point and Ranking Member Stiles' point as well, is that when these federal agencies are able to have advisory committees and capacity that are listening to local communities, that are defining what value chains, what industries, what approaches they want to take, when they've built that capacity, that brings those CDFIs or economic development districts together to create that vision for the communities. When those federal agencies are investing in these programs or creating these programs, and there is no accountability back to the local communities to understand how they can adjust and revise so that they can be more relevant to the needs of those communities, that's where the programs become stagnant and don't become impactful to, at least from my lived experience, the rural communities that I serve. So, there's a lot of benefit in some of the programs. I think the federal government absolutely has a role. That's why I'm proud to work for a district that listens to the needs of the region and then feeds that information back up to our federal partners. But that's got to be a two-way street.
I agree.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Davidson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses, and I really appreciated your written and oral testimony. And as we gather, I'm not sure we've highlighted the stat that at the start of this Congress, the 100 poorest congressional districts, if you ask the average person, they would think are overwhelmingly Democrats, because that's the narrative. The reality is it's pretty evenly divided. There are 51 that are represented by Republicans and 49 that are represented by Democrats. Of those poorest congressional districts, overwhelmingly the Democrat districts are represented by members of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, And in the Republican side, they're overwhelmingly represented by the more conservative members in the Freedom Caucus and the Republican Study Committee. So it seems that there would be a more collaborative approach given this dynamic, and I guess I'm always looking for ways to collaborate with colleagues to be able to do something useful. Often when we talk about inequality and growth, we tend to look at it as a left-right issue, but that's because of the solutions that are being offered haven't changed really since the 1800s, which is, one side says more government and one side says more freedom. And, I'm in heavily the more freedom, less government approach, but I think the big challenge is how do we get to sound money? Because when we're destroying the money, that's undermining. We're seeing that today. Inflation's hitting those 100 poorest congressional districts far harder than they are hitting the 100 wealthiest, 74 of which are represented by Democrats. 74. Overwhelmingly, the 100 wealthiest districts are Democrat districts, and they're getting wealthier. You wouldn't know that from the news or the coverage or the dialogue, and we talk about programs that do that. And so, Dr. Lowe, I listened with acute interest as you highlighted one of the problems with our system. Because as a guy, I got out of the Army, didn't know what I was going to do. I went back home to Ohio and got into manufacturing. It's been a tough stretch to be in manufacturing. Mayor Williams, I'll say, from Youngstown, thank you for highlighting the challenges we've had in Ohio and Youngstown, certainly like Dayton, Cincinnati region, where I'm from. It's been tough. And what's happened is our homegrown businesses, as they've scaled and run into more government, bad trade deals, heavy regulatory burdens, no access to capital, they get bought up by the hedge funds that are in the 100 wealthiest congressional districts. And they're owned there. Now, look, some of these folks are doing great things with their money, but they're heavily doing it in their communities. They're not doing it back home where the plants and the factories and the workers are. So I'm really interested to talk with you further and see how we get after that. I'm not sure that the answer is more government, but I am sure that we need to address the problem that we're seeing in terms of all the investment opportunities seem to go there. Now, I'm a big fan of the opportunity zone idea, and frankly, not just new market tax credits, but historic tax credits. Because when you look at the importance of getting investment into the urban core, whether that's a small town with 30,000 people, like Piqua, Ohio, or Greenville, Ohio, or a big city like Cincinnati, how do you prevent it from being hollowed out? Well, a lot of times the investment has to come in there, or the greenfield investment's cheaper next door. So we haven't really dealt with that. So, Mr. Johnson, how do opportunity zones help address those challenges in terms of even how the opportunity zones were developed? How does that help address that challenge?
Well, you make a couple of points that are important. First of all, as opportunity zones were coming out, I think everybody was excited about those and the opportunities that existed coming from that. I will tell you, in Elkhart, I don't believe they've been deployed much at all, if at any. Not because it's not a good program, but again, if it's going to be locally focused and it can be done locally, then that's the way that we're going to handle it. And so there's, in a time where we are seeing unprecedented growth and investment in Elkhart, one of the expectations, and goes to a point that you made, is there's an expectation that when you enter the Elkhart market, regardless of what you're doing, that you become part of the fabric. There is a civic and business responsibility to the community, and that comes from leadership, that comes from the expectation of those that are employed, it comes from those that are elected local officials and state officials as well. So when we look at those programs that have been developed, I will also tell you that the opportunity zones that exist that were lined up in Elkhart don't touch the most needy or underserved communities. It's funny,
they were drawn there, but they didn't
were
quite
drawn
work
for a
out
reason.
that way yet. So I wish I had more time to explore it in deference to my colleagues. I want to yield back, but I do highlight the way we fund it should go really federal dollars back to states, and I think we'd do a lot better job than trying to pick single projects from Washington, D.C. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Ms. Moore is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we're hearing you, Ms. Moore.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member. I really wish I could be with you here today, but I've listened very carefully to the witnesses and one of
Ms. Moore, I'm sorry. Will you suspend for 1 second? We've got no volume in the room, so we can't hear your question. Can we get whoever knows how to do this stuff to do this stuff? We good? Ms. Moore, try one more time. Maybe speak a little closer to the mic. Hopefully it'll work.
Okay, how am I doing?
That's a little better. Thank you. We'll start the clock at 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I guess I really wanted to sort of sort out things. The witness, one of our witnesses talked about the Tennessee Valley Authority as an example and the tremendous expense that it takes to actually turn a community around. Then we had other testimony from a couple of our witnesses that have talked about how important it is to engage the community so that you don't find yourself in a situation where you have, for example, tools that might be good, like opportunity zones, but nobody asked people, and it's more geared toward rate of return from the investor. No one asked whether you needed another storage unit in the area or not. There doesn't seem to be any initiative around some of these programs to create jobs for people or opportunities for anybody other than the investments. And we heard on tape, we've heard today about we don't need any more government, no more, we don't want, and I assume that doesn't mean that they don't want the money from the government. They just don't want the regulation and just to try to determine whether or not there is a rate of return from the community. So I guess I would like to ask the panel, how do you balance these exigencies, actually? How do you balance them? The need to do some place-based stuff so that you really can help the people in the community. But if you do them with no regulation, then you find that it only benefits the investors and not the people around the community. What should we be looking at as a model for meeting the needs of rural and urban communities and having the proper balance of regulation and investment?
Thank you for that question, ma'am. I'd love to jump in there. The first thing I'd like to emphasize is that I think we've heard from everyone here today that a one-size-fits-all solution doesn't work, and in particular, that urban and rural areas need different things. One of the key determinants out of concentrated poverty that I found in my research is that for neighborhoods experiencing concentrated poverty, if they're located in a county or region that is prosperous, becoming more regionally integrated with the economy can really make a difference for that neighborhood. So that's a different situation than neighborhoods experiencing concentrated poverty that are located in poor regions. Those regions need a really different approach, whether that's Appalachia, whether that's the Black Belt in the south, whether that's the Rio Grande River Valley, or whether it's tribal areas out west. These regions in the United States experiencing concentrated poverty each need their own solution. For neighborhoods in metropolitan areas that are more wealthy, I think we do have a host of models that we can look at and tweak to get right, whether it's trying to reform opportunity zones or tweak how we invest through new markets tax credits. I think that the answer is provide a mix of sources of capital, tax credits, and grants. It's to tighten up targeting a little bit to make sure that we're getting to places that have a mix of needs and assets. And then it's to make sure that we include a set aside for investing in local capacity and building local capacity.
Adding on
Thank
to
you.
that,
I
I'd
would
like
ask
to,
Mr. Johnson, that question, same question. No, there was a lot of talk about Elkhart and how it didn't produce anything. What do you think went wrong?
Ms. Moore, I'm
Mr.
sorry, who did
Johnson?
you direct that question to?
Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Johnson. Can you quickly repeat the question, Ms. Moore? We got garbled.
I'm so sorry, Mr. Johnson. There was a lot of discussion about Elkhart not really delivering or capitalizing on some of the investments. And I just wanted you to sort of dig a little bit deeper into what you think went wrong.
So again, I think a piece of that is the culture that I mentioned in my opening statement of Elkhart and understanding that we're going to move at the pace of business. Too often, the bureaucracy, the further you get away from local rule, creates barriers to the employment of that investment. I will give you a great example. About 5 years ago, the state of Indiana had a grant process, and it was called Regional Cities. South Bend Elkhart region was one of those recipients, and each of the 3 regions that received this grant received $42 million that had matching pieces to it. Just recently, they've done another round of what would be regional cities, but it is tied to federal money. And I will tell you that none of that money has been deployed at this point because the process has been so cumbersome that nobody can wrap their heads around it to deploy it. And that's around the state. So again, it's that local accountability, the local initiative, understanding what your needs are, and being able to move and deploy quickly. My guess is to some extent, as we look at the program that exists now, that has those barriers in place, it's going to be interesting to see how long it's going to take for that to be deployed. I will guarantee you in the meantime, locally, we're going to go ahead and get those things done.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Ms. Moore. The gentlelady's time has expired. Ms. Bice is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes and Ranking Member Style, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here this afternoon. Today's hearing is important to find more effective ways to get resources where they are needed most and to step away from the federal blanket approach that actually tends to decrease effectiveness. From my experience, local communities always have a better idea of what their citizens want and need rather than us here in Washington. Better enabling local decision-making and fund allocation can yield more effective results than a one-size-fits-all approach. If I can direct this question to Mr. Johnson, what policy measures can Congress enact, or more importantly, remove, to effectively help reduce the impacts of natural or man-made geographic barriers for disadvantaged communities?
Let me start here, and that's part of the reason that upon the invitation I came to this hearing in particular. As I mentioned in my statement, so often what we get from those that spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and again, I appreciate the work and the efforts that are put in by those that choose to serve our country in this way.
I'm a freshman, so I can't get blamed yet for any of those.
I'm not laying,
Sarah and I are.
I'm not laying any blame whatsoever. But as we talk about those policies, again, I think, as you mentioned, taking a very wide brush across the country is not the approach. Every community is an art piece, and it is. If you're going to make beautiful art, you've got to have those fine brushes that get the details. The policies that can be put in place or removed, however you want to look at it, have to be those that allow local community members, elected business leaders, those that are being impacted by those decisions, to be able to take advantage of opportunities to, as you are looking at, to decrease that level of disparity. And those investments take place in things such as, in Elkhart County and the South Bend Elkhart region, those things take place when we look at workforce development and how do how do we lessen the skills gap that exists that often gets in the way of those higher paying jobs. It's how do you support entrepreneurship in a county where the fastest growing entrepreneurs are people of color. It's how do you help build programs locally that people can touch, they can get to in a timely fashion to support their idea, make it happen, and still have someone someplace in place to support their work so that they can grow and sustain. It doesn't do any good for a business to start today and be out of business in a year. We want them there for 5 years and 10 years because that's where you're going to begin to draw that generational wealth that over time closes that skills gap, our wage gap.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, things like an incubator, promoting those types of incubator programs in your communities would actually, that are maybe specific to minorities or women-owned entrepreneurs may actually be of benefit.
It is a benefit, and it's the collaboration. Again, I talked about Elkhart, but I've mentioned the South Bend Elkhart region. We are a city of 54. The region itself is a region of 732 people. And we're constantly having conversations that impact the urban core and the very rural areas. In Elkhart County, 10% of our population is Amish. And so we understand that, again, if everybody's going to be in that boat, we got to make sure everybody's on that boat.
That's exactly right. You actually brought up a great point that segues into my next question. You brought up entrepreneurship, and given that education is a factor in lifting people out of poverty, can you discuss providing greater school choice and how that can help individuals living in maybe disadvantaged neighborhoods?
Again, being in the state of Indiana, which has led the way in school choice and voucher programs, I will tell you that, and somebody that comes from education, I appreciate the competitive aspect of that. I think it's forced all of us in education to get better, to compete in a different way. The rub is let's hold everybody to the same accountability. Okay, and that's something that we continue to address in the state. But education is critical, and it's not just that K-12 education. It's what does education look like once you graduate. Our graduation rate in Elkhart County is 93%, which is higher than the state average, is higher than the national average. But what happens after you graduate? And it's not just about going to college. It's what are those certification programs? What do internships and apprenticeships look like that, again, put people in the best place, not only for the work they're doing right now, but it's also about if I get in those places, I see new things, I've got new opportunities, and I've got an idea, and now can I go start my own business and do those things?
I am for your deal as somebody who has championed some legislation focused on workforce development, partnering with Career Tech, VOTEC, as well as higher ed. There's an opportunity for everyone, and I think we have to make sure that we're educating our young people that not everybody has to go to college to be successful. And that's a narrative I think that maybe my generation has passed down to has been passed down, and we need to kind of get out of that mindset. So I thank all of the witnesses for being here today, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Ms. Jacobs is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Dr. Bartik, I want to start with you. In your written testimony, you noted the impact of place on children's outcomes. And I think a lot of the literature around this talks a lot about how an individual child is benefited by going to a place or being in a place that has more opportunities. But clearly, the solution can't be to move all children to less distressed neighborhoods. And, families are deeply rooted in their communities, and all children deserve a fair shot, and not just the ones who can move. So can you briefly talk about what your research tells us about the impact of place on children's long-term economic outcomes and how we can ensure all neighborhoods provide opportunities for children to experience economic mobility?
Yes, thank you for the question. Well, we know that certain neighborhoods have very poor opportunities for upward mobility for kids in those neighborhoods. The kids who grow up in those neighborhoods simply do not do as well as adults as kids growing up in other neighborhoods. And that's holding constant the characteristics of the family. Now, we're not sure we completely understand all the causes of this, but one driver appears to be the adult employment rate in that neighborhood. Now, why would that matter? Well, the adult employment rate affects whether there are role models for kids, It affects the crime rate in the neighborhood. It affects when the kids get to be teenagers, whether there are job contacts, job networks where people can find jobs. So it has an enormous effect on whether kids see hope and a way to get forward. So how do we change child outcomes in some of these distressed neighborhoods? What do we do? Well, first of all, I would say that not everything, okay, so I'm a big fan of place-based policies. I do not think that everything that needs to be done is place-based policies. So I think in general, we need to deal with the child care and preschool sector and really invest significantly more in creating more access to high-quality, affordable child care and preschool, and that needs to be done on a universal basis, not just in distressed places. But we also need to target those distressed places and see if we can get adults in those neighborhoods into well-paying jobs. Well, how do we do that? We don't solve that problem simply by plopping jobs down the neighborhood because most people don't work in their neighborhood. That's not the way the labor market works. What we have to do is make services available to people in those neighborhoods so they can get well-paying jobs. Now, some of that is, maybe a transit pass. Some of it could be getting their car fixed and getting access to a loan to get their car fixed. Some of it could be job training. And some of it actually would be childcare. We know we have childcare deserts in this country, places where childcare is lacking. If we can provide outside funding through a federal block grant, a state block grant, I don't care where it comes from, but a resource that is not available to these neighborhoods because they don't have the money, to, for example, to take a childcare desert neighborhood and make sure that there are childcare centers, which would be, by the way, in many cases, a form of private sector job creation. We could help entrepreneurs in that neighborhood start their own childcare center. So those would be dual-use programs. We would be simultaneously helping adults into jobs by providing childcare, while also helping better child development through that childcare center if it's run in a high-quality way.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, let the record state all of the other witnesses were shaking their head yes about childcare also. I want to dig in on this a little bit more. If you could talk about how high-quality early childhood programs compare with some of the other solutions we've been talking about. I know in your book you mentioned that high-quality early child care could even be a more effective return on investment than these business tax incentives that we've been talking about.
Right. Well, we know that early childhood programs have an enormous return on investment. That if they're in a high-quality way, I emphasize. No one is saying a lousy preschool program does wonders. You have to run in a high-quality way with teachers who are paid well and well-trained, reasonable class sizes, et cetera, reasonable curriculum. And if you do that, you're working on the labor supply side of the labor market. What you're doing is increasing the quality of the labor supply. And by doing that, you're building up prosperity of your economy. And that has an enormous rate of return. Now, business tax incentives can work, but they tend to be expensive per job created. And the rate of return to a high-quality early childhood program in terms of producing high-quality jobs for people by working on the labor supply side of the labor market is actually much higher than that of business tax incentives working on the demand side of the labor market. I think on the demand side of the labor market, some of these customized services to create jobs in small business, things like small business development centers and customized training are a more effective way of working on the labor demand side. But early childhood programs are a great way of building out the labor supply side of the economy in local areas.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Arrington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and witnesses, for your time and discussion about this place-based development. The place I hail from is very rural, so that's sort of my perspective on this. But just to continue with Ms. Jacobs' points, and I know she cares about the families who need child care services, and I don't diminish that as an importance to all families, and especially with inflation, people can hardly afford to heat and cool their home. They've lost, because of inflation, $400 a month. 7, 8 out of 10 people, families, don't even have $1,000 in their checking and savings accounts. I don't know how they're making it, quite frankly. But much of this is self-inflicted. So no matter what our intentions are, and I think they're all good, and I think probably
the goal we have is probably shared by Republicans and Democrats. You got to be real careful of the unintended consequences. For example, of paying people more to stay on plussed up unemployment benefits than to go back to work. I know in my part of the country, people couldn't hire anybody back because they were making more on unemployment. That was a huge problem. And if we're going to flood the market with federal dollars, you're going to outstrip, demand from supply, and you're going to have people who are going to be broke. More people are going to be broke than they were before. So I like with childcare, just my perspective on it. Let people keep more of their money. Let them have more of their hard-earned money to spend on childcare. We had a child tax credit, so Republicans doubled that in our tax reform initiative. But then my Democrat colleagues, wanted to make it a refundable tax credit so that whether you worked or not, you were going to get cash per child upwards of $3,000 for the year. That's not incentivizing people to go back to work. And so the small business guys in rural America, and I can't speak for every corner of our country, really struggled. Federally mandated wages was another challenge. It makes the cost of childcare go up. So let people keep more of their money, stop putting all these mandates and regulations that drive the costs up, and build back better, penalize faith-based institutions. In some parts of America, the church is the only place they can take their child, and they weren't benefiting from it. So I just think these are common sense issues. I don't think this is an ideological thing. So I guess my first observation on this is that we should make sure that our broad-based policies are there to support development. I mean, when we're trying to incentivize through opportunity zones or empowerment zones or whatever, and I'm more for letting the private sector drive it, I don't want the federal government to create a market. I read your testimony, Mr. Johnson, about electric vehicles and the debacle that was. The federal government cannot just prop up infinitum a market, but we can help pull a market to more sustainability. And I think those tax incentives are probably the best way to do it. And maybe even tax credits the best way, because if you're not making anything, you're not benefiting from it. So there's got to be a market, there's got to be income, and sort of that's, kind of my sort of philosophical view. But when you're trying to pull the market through incentives, not create one, and from Washington, for heaven's sakes, but when you're incentivizing in partnership with local control, local decisions, private sector led, you have the best chance of actually creating something sustainable. But on one end, you're trying to pull that growth and development, and on the other side, again, and not trying to be too partisan here, but my colleagues are proposing to double the capital gains tax to 43, add the state tax, and it's 50%. Now, you think people are going to want to invest where they're going to have to give, after they've paid their income taxes and every other tax, sales tax, franchise tax, they're going to pay 50%. Half their money is going to go back to the government. So the government can centrally plan some other market somewhere that won't work. I know that the hearts here are pure in wanting this place-based development, but we need to do it the right way, or we're going to fritter away the monies that we're stewarding, and our children, who are $30 trillion now in a deferred tax, because that's what our debt is on them, are not going to be well served. So anyway, I appreciate your highlighting that example in your testimony, but I respect all of you. We got to get it right, or the unintended consequences are worse than the cure. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I went over my time and once again did not get to a question.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Donalds is recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, can I insert something into the record really quickly?
Yeah, Mr. Donalds, let me withdraw that recognition. Yes, Ms. Jacobs, you're recognized.
I'd like to insert into the record a research paper from the Social Policy Institute at Washington and St. Louis. The expanded child tax credit payments did not reduce employment.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Donalds, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm glad you're submitting that for the record, Ms. Jacobs. I would love to actually read that because that would be an interesting read. So, we'd love to get that from the chair and the committee. Witnesses, thanks so much for being here. I mean, look, let's get to it. I think that, I think we've always had these fundamental economic issues in certain communities, similar to, community I grew up in Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, New York. And I think the key thing is always what's that balance between grant funding, tax policy, and then just organic economic growth, and really what are those drivers of organic economic growth. I think that one of the things, if we've take a step back from all this and we've really examined a lot of the programming that started from the Great Society forward, is we've spent trillions now in all different kind of strategies to address economic disparities, to try to bring different segments of the American population into more parity, I guess might be the word, with respect to accessing the American dream. We've done it in a myriad of ways: housing policy, grant funding, education funding, direct subsidies, et cetera. We've kind of run the gamut on all of them. The one area, and Dr. Lowe, quick question. I mean, for me, the one thing I'm trying to understand is, in areas of extreme poverty, this is all my own personal experience, not data-driven, but what I've seen growing up. The three base characteristics I've always seen are educational issues, healthcare issues, and access to capital issues, economic issues. Like, in what you've seen, am I wrong in what kind of the three primary drivers are in these type of communities?
No, sir, I think you're correct that those are all really important. I would also add to that list environmental quality.
Okay.
So
all right.
it's things like air pollution or point source pollution.
Okay. The reason I ask is because one of the solutions, which is really not a DC-focused policy, it's something much more on the state level, has been, academic freedom, parental choices, whatever the case might be. I noticed in a lot of the testimony you guys were advocating for far more flexibility with respect to federal grant programs, block granting. I think Dr. Bardick, that's what you were referencing, block granting, which, when it comes to block granting stuff to states for them to work it, as opposed to us doing out of the alphabet soup agencies, I actually agree with that to a large degree. But one of the areas that I believe has always had direct impact to the lives of kids or people who are trying to matriculate up the economic ladder is flexibility in their academic experience. And so I think that one of the things that we have to take stock of in some of these communities is that access to different academic options is severely lacking in a lot of these communities if we were going to stack that. I mean, if any of you guys actually studied that and seen that in any of your data about what would be the potential impacts of having a far more diverse academic experience with respect to upward mobility in economics.
Yeah, I've done some research in that area, so have my colleagues at the Upjohn Institute. I think we do need a much more robust career education programs in the U.S. than we currently do. I mean, some of our leading competitors like Germany have far better developed vocational education programs. We also need better access to higher education. I come from Kalamazoo, which has the Kalamazoo Promise, a place-based scholarship program that funds kids not only to go to University of Michigan or Michigan State, but also go to the community college, or for that matter, go into an apprenticeship program. So all of these are ways of telling the kids from the time they're in second grade, you will have access to higher education opportunities. So this goes beyond place-based policy, although it can be related. I mean, place-based scholarships are one way to help develop an economy and attract people to the area. That was one of the rationales for the Kalamazoo Promise. But I really do think we do need, you're absolutely right, we need to invest more in education, which goes beyond the issue of place-based policies, but is part of it.
All right, well, Mr. Johnson, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, sorry, I appreciate the comment about the vocational, focus in a lot of European countries that are far ahead of where we are. But again, I would point to some of the local, again, using our area as an example, we've got an organization called Horizon Education Alliance that worked with businesses, is continuing to work with businesses to build out career pathways that at elementary level, you know before you leave elementary what the career pathways in these organizations are, what you need to do to get there, and that is from entry-level positions to sitting in the CEO seat. On top of that, through the organization, which is a collaboration of business, education, and government locally, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, prior to the pandemic, a group of 40 from our region hopped on a plane and went to Switzerland and went to Germany to look at those programs. And so now when we see the apprenticeship programs that are taking place that have really led and helped the state of Indiana develop also in that space, that K-12 piece, the post-K-12 piece, the focus on all levels of education, but to meet those career pathways, that education is so critical that you're talking about. But you've got to make sure not only is the research there, you've got to make sure you're able to apply it, and you've got to be able to move when it's time to move. If it's not working or it's not working at the level you want it to move, you've got to be able to do that.
Mr. Johnson, I appreciate what you said. I'm like a minute over, and I thank the chairman for indulgence. Mr. Chairman, I'm wrapping here, like 30 seconds.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
And other members present will be afforded the same courtesy if they want.
Absolutely, thank you. No, I just think, look, at the end of the day, the big thing is that we have so many different questions about how to attack this issue. I would say, especially coming from what I've seen from you guys earlier today, that we here in the nation's capital have failed to realize that top-down tinkering in communities is just not effective. By the time we get the information up here, the problem set has changed, the conditions have adjusted, and so what is needed is far more ability on a local level to really get at the acute issues that affect these different communities. And my last comment, Mr. Chairman, is as somebody who is a supporter of academic reforms and education empowerment, I think that it is high time that young people in the United States have an ability to find the academic home that will suit their interests the best so they can transform their lives, and by that measure, transform their families and transform their communities. I yield back. I know I'm way over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. We are about to start voting, and we're crawling on 2 hours, so I'm going to bring us to a close. I'm going to use my Donald's 2 minutes, though, to enter into a very brief colloquy with the ranking member, and it results in actually an ask of our witnesses. The ranking member got me thinking when he gave this example of the, I guess, electric truck company in Elkhart. And it really it reminded me of Solyndra. I was here when we heard a lot about Solyndra. And it's a complicated story, but it poses a really interesting question, which is, should the federal government be in the business of making direct investments in private corporations? And candidly, I've now seen 3 presidents very aggressively pick winners and losers, some cases subsidy. And I think it's a really interesting question. The Recovery Act is actually, I looked it up, Elkhart got all kinds of money to redo a runway in the municipal airport and to redo their sewer systems and to pave roads, but that's more traditional government role. So I guess without going on at length here, it's a really interesting question about whether the federal government should be making investments directly in private firms. And of course, we just went through a pandemic in which the PPP program and the shuttered venues program and the restaurant program put a lot of taxpayer money, obviously under conditions of pandemic. That's a different situation. But I would just love to ask our witnesses to maybe, not now, because we do have to go vote, but maybe if you feel like it, give us a little bit of a response on the question of, should the federal government be in the business of making investments directly into private companies, and if so, what sort of protections would serve the public good in doing that? So that's the end of my part of the colloquy. In all fairness, I want to give the ranking member an opportunity to add anything to that.
No, I think it's an important topic because we see millions of dollars being invested, and what's the real world impact? And I think Mr. Donalds brought it up that often by the time the information gets to us, the conditions in the ground have changed. It's why the private sector model is so strong and why I'm so interested in the data that I do believe will be forthcoming on opportunity zones. And so look forward to, appreciate today's conversation. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, no, I appreciate, thanks to the ranking member. And again, the time I've been here has been characterized by an awful lot of direct investment. I came here in '09, and the first thing that happened, of course, well, actually it happened in '08 under a Republican president, a massive rescue of the financial services industry. So we're very much in the business of making these direct investments, either under duress or not, in the private sector. Anyway, I'll leave it there, but I would just ask Dr. Bartek, I can't enter into I can't extend this further, but please do respond to the committee in writing with whatever thoughts you have about whether we should be doing that, and if so, what sort of protections and guidance would you give us in future programs along that line. So I thank the members, and I'd like to thank in particular our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record, and I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address provided to your offices. With that, I thank all of the witnesses once again, and the hearing is adjourned.